What could possibly make a man who has everything, a mansion on the hill, a fleet of luxury cars, and a reputation for power, risk it all over a single paycheck he refuses to honor? Imagine this. The sound of rain tapping against the wide glass windows of a lavish estate just outside New York City. Inside, in the glow of polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers, stands Michael, a wealthy businessman who has built his empire on money, ego, and a belief that nothing and no one can ever touch him. But across from him, holding a crumpled envelope that was supposed to contain her week's wages, stands Linda, his maid, a woman whose tired eyes tell the story of long shifts, endless sacrifice, and a quiet resilience that money can't measure. And in that moment when she asks for what she has rightfully earned, Michael looks her in the eye and says, "No." Have you ever seen arrogance so blinding that a person can't recognize the storm they're inviting into their own life? Stay with me until the end, because what unfolds in the minutes that follow may surprise you. Michael thought he was untouchable. He thought denying Linda's salary was nothing more than a display of authority, a reminder that in his world, power meant control. But what he didn't realize was that Linda held something he could never buy back once it slipped through his fingers. A key, not just to her dignity, but to a fortune he never imagined was tied to her. Let's pause here for a second. How many times have we seen stories where the lines between the rich and the poor seem so clear? One side full of pride and comfort, the other weighed down by need and survival? And yet, life has a way of flipping those lines, of showing us that wealth without compassion is nothing more than a fragile illusion. Have you ever been through this? A moment when someone underestimated you, dismissed your worth, only to discover later that you carried something they desperately needed. Linda's story is one of thousands. Across America, working mothers trying to keep food on the table, balancing bills that never seem to end, often invisible to the very people they serve. But what makes this moment extraordinary isn't just the injustice of unpaid wages. It's the ripple effect that begins the second Michael refuses. What you're about to discover now may surprise you. Arrogance can collapse faster than a house of cards when it collides with dignity, truth, and resilience. Picture Linda leaving that glittering mansion, her footsteps echoing on the wet pavement, not with despair, but with a strange calm. She knows something Michael doesn't. She knows the power she holds, not in wealth, not in status, but in knowledge, in access, in the simple fact that his world isn't as unshakable as he thinks. And Michael, still inside, sipping his expensive wine, has no idea that his single careless decision has set the stage for his greatest reckoning. As the night deepens, the contrast becomes sharper. Michael, drowning in luxury, Linda facing the cold with nothing but determination. Two lives crossing at the fault line of injustice, about to be shaken in ways neither of them expected. The question isn't just whether Michael will regret his arrogance, it's how quickly that regret will come and what price he'll be forced to pay for it. And this is where the real story begins. Because within minutes, Michael will discover that Linda, the woman he dismissed so easily, is the one person standing between him and the survival of everything he thought he controlled. Do you want me to continue building the next section, Michael's world of wealth and ego, in the same tone and rhythm, keeping around 600-700 words per block so it flows as a long-form video script? Michael believed he was in complete control, that the power of his wealth would always shield him from consequences. Yet the truth is, the moment he refused to pay Linda, something shifted. It wasn't just about dollars and cents. It was about respect, dignity, and the invisible weight of choices we often dismiss as small. And maybe you've felt that too. Maybe you've seen someone underestimate the value of another human being, or maybe you've been in Linda's shoes, fighting for something that was rightfully yours, while the world pretended not to see. If any part of this story stirs something inside you, I'd love for you to share it in the comments. What does it bring up for you? Anger, recognition, hope? Your words matter here because every comment adds another voice to this conversation, reminding us that these stories aren't just fiction, they mirror real struggles happening every day. And when you add your voice, you're not only speaking for yourself, you're helping build a community of people who believe that dignity and respect should never be optional. And while you're here, if the message so far has connected with you, consider liking this video. It may seem like a simple click, but it's what tells me and tells the platform that these stories matter, that people want more content that digs deep into issues of justice, compassion, and redemption. And if you feel this is the kind of journey you'd like to continue with me, subscribing is the best way to stay close. Every new subscriber is a sign that this channel isn't just growing. It's becoming a space where voices unite, where lessons are shared, and where empathy finds a stage. Your presence here really does make a difference. Without you, it's just a story told into the void. With you, it becomes something alive, something capable of reaching people who might need this reminder right now. So, stay with me until the end, because what happens next in Michael and Linda's story is about to show us just how fragile arrogance can be, and how powerful truth becomes when it refuses to stay silent. The mansion rose like a monument to excess, its ivory walls glowing under the afternoon sun, towering above the quiet suburban neighborhood where it sat like an island of privilege. Michael had designed it to be that way, a statement that he was not just wealthy, but untouchable. The manicured hedges were trimmed with mathematical precision. The fountain at the entrance sprayed arcs of crystal water into the air, and the garage housed cars that most people only saw on glossy magazine covers. A black Mercedes, a silver Bentley, even a vintage Mustang polished so perfectly it looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line. For Michael, these were not vehicles, they were symbols, proof of his power, his control, his ability to bend life to his will. Inside, the air smelled faintly of imported leather and expensive wine. Marble floors stretched across rooms so vast they echoed when he walked through them. In his study, bookshelves reached toward the ceiling, filled not with novels or stories, but with business manuals, financial records, and trophies of corporate victories. To anyone else it was intimidating. To Michael it was reassurance that he had climbed higher than anyone around him. "People envy me," he once told a colleague over lunch at an exclusive New York club. "They see me as proof that discipline and ambition win. But what they don't understand is, I don't just play the game, I own it." It was the kind of mindset that had driven him since his 20s. He believed life was a battlefield, and money was the armor. Compassion, he called it weakness. Empathy, a distraction. Every decision he made was filtered through a single question: what does it give me in return? And as long as the answer was profit, status, or recognition, he pressed forward without hesitation. His reputation in the city reflected that. Michael was the man who closed deals others thought impossible, the investor who spotted opportunities before anyone else. At charity galas, he appeared in tailored suits, shaking hands, smiling for photographs. But the people who worked closest to him knew the truth. They knew the man behind the polished exterior was cold, impatient, and often ruthless. To them, he was a storm disguised as calm waters. Linda, his maid, had seen it up close more than once. She was invisible in his world, dusting shelves, cleaning windows, setting the table before his meetings. He rarely looked her in the eye, and when he did, it was with the detached air of someone glancing at a piece of furniture. For Michael, Linda wasn't a person with a story. She was a function, a service, part of the machinery that kept his world spotless and impressive. One evening, while sipping a glass of Bordeaux older than she was, Michael glanced at her and remarked, "You're lucky, you know. Most people would kill for the chance to work in a house like this." Linda swallowed the sting of his words. "I'm grateful for the work, sir," she replied softly. though inside she thought of the bills waiting on her kitchen table and the second-hand sneakers her son Ethan wore to school. Michael didn't notice. He was already turning back to his wine, lost in the glow of his own reflection in the polished glass of the window. That was the rhythm of his life, centered on himself, blind to the small but vital threads of humanity surrounding him. The city viewed him as a success story, but success can be a mask. Behind the scenes, cracks were already forming in his empire, though he refused to see them. Business partners whispered about his arrogance. Employees left quietly, tired of his impossible demands. But Michael's mindset left no room for self-doubt. If they can't keep up, that's their problem, he would say, brushing off concerns with a flick of his hand. In his world, everything was a transaction. Loyalty was purchased, respect was demanded. Kindness had no measurable return, so he saw no need for it. The idea that someone like Linda could hold any kind of power over him would have made him laugh. To Michael, power meant control over contracts, stocks, and bank accounts, not the quiet resilience of a woman scrubbing the floors he walked on. Yet that was the hidden truth he couldn't grasp. Sometimes power doesn't wear a suit or drive a Mercedes. Sometimes it looks like a woman who knows more than you realize, who carries a strength born not of wealth, but of necessity. And while Michael was busy congratulating himself for the empire he had built, Linda was watching, learning, remembering details he never imagined would matter. The contrast between them couldn't have been sharper. Michael's journey had been fueled by privilege and the certainty that he was destined for greatness. Linda's journey was marked by sacrifice, by late nights spent working 2 jobs, by a mindset shaped not by abundance, but by survival. He flaunted his fortune as proof of superiority, while she carried her struggles quietly, each one shaping her resilience like steel under fire. Michael believed vulnerability was a flaw, something to hide or crush in others. But the irony was that his greatest vulnerability had been in front of him all along, disguised as the maid who dusted his shelves and set his dinner table. He had mistaken her silence for weakness, her politeness for passivity, never realizing that strength often hides behind humility. On the surface, Michael's mansion looked unshakable, a fortress built on stone and wealth. But beneath the marble floors and chandeliers, the foundation was thinner than he knew. His decisions, his arrogance, his refusal to acknowledge the humanity of the people around him. Each was a crack, widening slowly. And Linda, unseen and underestimated, was standing right at the fault line. The day he refused her salary wasn't an isolated moment of arrogance. It was the climax of a pattern, a revelation of who he truly was when faced with the simplest test of fairness. He thought denying her was nothing, a detail too small to matter. But hidden in that single decision was the impact of years of dismissing others, of ignoring the quiet voices that could one day rise louder than money itself. Michael adjusted his cufflinks that afternoon, admiring the shine of gold against his tailored shirt. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the driveway where his cars waited like loyal soldiers. Inside, Linda stood quietly, holding the envelope that should have carried her wages. Her hands tightened around it, not because of the money inside, though she desperately needed it, but because of what his refusal represented. It wasn't just about being underpaid, it was about being unseen, unheard, dismissed. He waved her off with a cold smile. "You'll get it later. Don't make a scene over something so small." Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. "Small to you, maybe, but to me, it's everything." Michael didn't answer. He had already turned away, convinced that his authority ended the conversation. Yet in that dismissal lay the seed of his downfall. For in the quiet strength of Linda's reply, something had shifted, not in Michael, at least not yet, but in the balance of power he thought he controlled. And while he poured himself another glass of wine, savoring the taste of victory in a battle he didn't even recognize, the story was already moving in a direction he could never predict, carrying him toward revelations that would transform not only his fortune, but his entire understanding of what power truly means. Linda's world was far from the polished marble floors of Michael's mansion. Her mornings began before sunrise in a small apartment tucked away on the edge of the city. The walls were thin, the plumbing old, and the hum of traffic from the nearby freeway was the background music to her life. Yet for her, that space was more than four walls. It was home. It was where her son Ethan's laughter echoed in the evenings, where his school drawings decorated the fridge, where second-hand furniture carried the weight of their story. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filled with the one thing she valued more than anything Michael had ever owned: love. She woke up each day at 5 a.m., slipping out of bed quietly so as not to wake Ethan. By the time he stirred, she had already prepared his breakfast: oatmeal if they had enough milk, toast if the budget was tight. Ethan, just 9 years old, never complained. He understood, in the way children sometimes do, that his mother's exhaustion was not a choice, but a necessity. "Mom, don't worry," he would say, adjusting his backpack before school. "One day I'll buy you a big house," Linda would smile, smoothing down his hair, her heart aching with both pride and sadness. "I don't need a big house, sweetheart," she'd reply softly. "I just need you to chase your dreams." The weight of responsibility pressed on her shoulders daily, but Linda carried it with quiet strength. She worked not one, but 2 jobs: Michael's mansion by day and a diner at night. Each dollar mattered, each tip tucked away for rent, groceries, and the dream of maybe sending Ethan to college one day. She had learned to stretch a paycheck like a magician, turning scraps into meals, turning second-hand clothes into something Ethan could wear proudly. And yet, no matter how hard she worked, it always seemed like the bills multiplied faster than her earnings. Her exhaustion was visible in her hands, cracked from cleaning chemicals, in her feet that ached from standing for hours, in the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of rest could erase. Still, she never let Ethan see the full depth of her struggle. To him, she was steady, reliable, a mother who could make anything work. That was her hidden truth. Behind the scenes of hardship was a well of resilience, deeper than she ever admitted to anyone. Working for Michael was supposed to be the more stable part of her life. The mansion paid better than most jobs she could get, and though she endured his arrogance and indifference, she kept her head down because the paycheck mattered more than his coldness. She accepted his dismissive remarks, the way he sometimes treated her presence like an inconvenience, because at the end of the day, her wages kept food on Ethan's plate. But when he refused to pay her salary, the impact was immediate and devastating. To Michael, it was just money, something he spent on a single bottle of wine. To Linda, it was the rent for their apartment, groceries for the week, bus fare to get Ethan to school. It was survival. She left the mansion that evening holding an empty envelope, her heart heavy, but her face calm. She didn't cry. She had long ago trained herself to hold back tears until Ethan was asleep. Instead, she walked through the rain with her head held high, telling herself over and over, "I'll figure it out. I always do." But the truth pressed against her chest with each step. There was nothing left to stretch, nothing left to cut back. Without that paycheck, the fragile balance she had built could collapse in days. At home, Ethan greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, showing her a drawing he had made in school. "Look, Mom, it's us. You're holding my hand and we're walking to the park." Linda smiled, holding the paper close to her chest. "It's beautiful, baby," she whispered. He didn't need to know that she had skipped lunch that day so he could have a fuller dinner. He didn't need to know that the landlord's reminder about rent was already folded in her purse, waiting for an answer she didn't have. What struck Linda most about Michael's refusal wasn't just the unfairness, it was the insult. He had looked at her as though her work, her hours of scrubbing and polishing, meant nothing. as though the effort she poured into making his mansion gleam had no value. It wasn't just a decision, it was a revelation of how little he thought of her existence, and that more than the missing money cut the deepest. "Why doesn't he see?" she whispered to herself one night while folding Ethan's laundry. "Why can't he understand what this means?" But even as the words left her lips, she knew the answer. People like Michael didn't live in her world. They didn't understand sacrifice, or late-night worries, or the courage it took just to keep going when everything seemed stacked against you. Still, Linda was not someone who surrendered easily. She had weathered storms before, being abandoned by Ethan's father, losing her mother too young, working through sickness when she couldn't afford to rest. Each challenge had hardened her resolve, and while Michael thought denying her wages was the end of the story, Linda knew better. Life had taught her that decisions always carried weight, that arrogance always left cracks in its foundation, and that hidden truths had a way of surfacing when least expected. As she tucked Ethan into bed that night, he asked innocently, "Mom, are we okay?" She kissed his forehead and whispered, "We'll always be okay." Her voice was steady, though her heart raced with uncertainty. But within that promise was a determination stronger than Michael could ever imagine. Linda was fighting not just for herself, but for the future of her child. And when a mother fights for her child, no arrogance, no mansion, no refusal can truly stand in her way. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it carried the potential for transformation, not just for Linda, but for Michael too. Because what he had dismissed as insignificant was about to become the thread that unraveled. The world he thought was unshakable, revealing consequences he never saw coming, and a shift in power that would expose the hidden truth behind the life he had built. The rain had not stopped since Linda left Michael's mansion that evening, and it seemed to echo the weight of her unanswered pleas. To her, those wages were survival. To him, they were nothing but a trivial matter, so small in his eyes that it barely deserved a second thought. The clash between their worlds was never more apparent than in that dimly lit study, when her quiet voice carried both dignity and desperation, and his sharp response cut it down without mercy. Michael leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, as if the conversation were nothing more than an interruption to his evening ritual. Linda stood near the doorway, her hands pressed tightly against the envelope she had expected to be full, but found instead disturbingly light. She cleared her throat, her voice calm yet trembling. "Mr. Carter, I worked the full month. I need my salary. It's not just about me, it's about my son. I can't wait any longer." He exhaled slowly, almost theatrically, his eyes glinting with impatience. "Linda, it's insignificant. Do you hear me? Pennies. Don't stand there as if this is some great injustice. You clean, you dust, you sweep. I could have 10 people lined up outside tomorrow begging to take your place." Her lips parted, but no words came at first. The insult stung more than the denial itself. She steadied her breath, refusing to bow her head. "To you it may be pennies," she whispered, "but to me it's the roof over my son's head." Michael smirked, sipping his wine as though savoring victory. "If $50 makes or breaks you, maybe you're in the wrong business. I can't babysit everyone's financial mistakes. You'll get your money when I say so. Until then, stop making it sound like the world is ending." The cruelty of his words filled the room like smoke, suffocating, impossible to escape. To him, it was simply control. Another reminder that in his domain, his word was final. To her, it was a revelation, a behind-the-scenes glimpse into just how little he valued the people who kept his perfect life running. That night, Michael wasn't just refusing wages. He was erasing her humanity with every syllable. Linda's hands trembled slightly, but her voice, though soft, carried a hidden strength. "One day, you'll understand what this means," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "And when you do, it will be too late." He laughed, dismissive and cold. "Please, spare me the dramatics. You're a maid, Linda, not a prophet. Don't act as if you have any say in what happens in my life." but there was something in her gaze, steady, unflinching, that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. For the first time in years, Michael felt a flicker of discomfort, though he quickly drowned it with another sip of wine. The irony was brutal. While he considered her request beneath his attention, the reality was that Linda held something far greater than he realized. Hidden in her silence, in her resilience, was a key he didn't know existed. She had access, knowledge, and connections woven into his household that no amount of money could replace. The decisions he made that night would ripple into places he couldn't yet imagine, places where his wealth and reputation would no longer shield him. Michael returned to his paperwork, as though the conversation had ended. "Close the door on your way out," he muttered, his voice dripping with indifference. Linda's feet felt heavy as she turned to leave, yet every step she took was lined with determination. On the outside, she looked defeated, but inside, something was shifting. The cruelty had not broken her, it had transformed her. She realized that Michael's arrogance wasn't just about her wages, it was about power, the same power he wielded over employees, partners, and anyone who stood in his way. But arrogance blinds, and blindness leaves cracks wide enough for truth to slip through. The storm outside grew louder, lightning streaking across the night sky, as though nature itself was echoing her silent vow. She wouldn't beg again. She wouldn't humiliate herself in front of a man who saw her as less than human. Instead, she would bide her time, and when the moment came, she would reveal the hidden truth that would turn his fortress of power into a house of cards. Meanwhile, Michael settled, deeper into his chair, convinced he had won a minor skirmish. In his mind, denying Linda her wages was nothing more than a decision of convenience. He told himself it was about principle, about reminding her and everyone that no one questioned his authority. Yet beneath his confidence lay something fragile, something he refused to name, the gnawing sense that perhaps he had crossed a line he didn't fully understand. "Insignificant," he whispered again, as if repeating the word could make it true. But the echo of Linda's voice, "To me, it's everything," lingered in the corners of the room, long after she had gone, a reminder that even the smallest decisions can carry the weight of revelation. And as the storm raged on outside, the balance between power and vulnerability began to shift, though Michael couldn't yet see the impact. The journey he believed he controlled was already slipping from his hands, carrying him toward a truth he would soon be forced to face. The night after Michael's refusal, Linda sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, the same table where she sorted bills by urgency and penciled numbers into the margins of envelopes. A single lamp cast a warm circle of light across a clutter of notices and receipts, the quiet ticking of a second-hand clock marking the seconds she could not afford to waste. Ethan was asleep in the next room, his breathing steady, his school backpack propped against the door, the way he always left it. Outside, the city hummed with distant sirens and the occasional rumble of the elevated train. In that tiny apartment, everything felt fragile and yet unbreakable at once, like a tightrope stretched across the sky, and Linda walking it without a net. She lifted a faded folder from the shelf, the one she kept hidden behind recipe books and a jar of loose screws, and laid it open. Paper clips held together creased photocopies, handwritten notes, and a small, worn photograph that made her pause before she tucked it back under the others. She didn't need the reminder. She knew what she carried. She knew, even if Michael did not, that sometimes the most valuable things are kept in the quietest places. She had spent years inside the routines of that mansion, unseen but observant. There had been days where the housekeeper duties blurred together, polishing the same banister, dusting the same study, setting the same silverware along the same glossy table. But Linda's mind was never idle. She noticed patterns and anomalies, the way a nurse notices a change in breathing, or a mechanic hears the faintest rattle beneath the hood. She noticed when Michael's tone changed after a phone call, when a courier delivered a letter that didn't go through the usual assistant, When certain locked drawers were opened on days tied to specific calendar marks, she noticed the framed photo that disappeared from the hallway and reappeared in his office the week his attorney visited. She noticed the worn leather box in his father's, handwriting tucked in the back of the library shelf, the one Michael never touched but never moved either. She hadn't started paying attention out of curiosity. It was survival, a mindset shaped by years of making decisions that had immediate consequences. When life leaves you no cushion, you learn to gather information, not to gossip or pry, but to keep your footing when the ground shifts. You see everything, an older maid had once told her, half warning and half blessing. Just don't let them. See that you see, Linda had nodded. I don't need them to know, she had replied. I just need to know. And she knew enough now to understand that Michael's fortune wasn't built only on clean contracts and public victories. There were pieces of it that had been inherited and others that were still unsettled. His late father, a man of imposing presence even in old photographs, had left a legacy that was more complicated than Michael liked to admit. The city liked to tell the story of generational success, but behind the scenes there had been disputes, handwritten notes in margins instead of formal addendums, old friends turned silent skeptics, and a series of decisions made in haste when health began to fail. Linda didn't know everything, but she knew which cabinet held a key that didn't match any door she'd seen, and she knew that lockboxes didn't always live in banks. Why do people keep secrets they can't afford to keep? She murmured to herself as she flipped a page. She skimmed her own notes, dates and names she'd recorded not out of malice, but because memory can be a slippery thing when you're juggling 2 jobs and a 9-year-old school schedule. A delivery Wednesday that skipped reception and went straight to the study. A phone call that turned Michael's voice from grating to tight and measured. An old legal envelope stamped with a firm in Boston that had once represented his father. The name stuck with her, and not because it meant anything to a maid. It stuck because Michael had torn the return label off and shredded it separately, a small act that meant nothing to most people and everything to someone who learned to read the edges as carefully as the center. Her phone vibrated with a message from the diner, someone calling in sick. Could she cover a shift tomorrow if needed? She typed back that she would do her best, then stared again at the folder. She hadn't sought leverage. She hadn't wanted a reason to hold anything over anyone's head. But there are moments when life nudges you toward your own hidden strength, when the journey you never planned turns into the only path forward. Linda felt the weight of that shift now, not as revenge, but as revelation. Michael's world wasn't untouchable. It was pieced together with routines and assumptions, and she had seen the seams. At the mansion the next morning, the house moved with its usual choreography. Gardener hoses hissing across the lawn, the hum of an espresso machine, the murmur of the intercom. Michael paced through the foyer in a crisp suit, gesturing into his phone while the driver waited by the door. "Don't overthink it," he said sharply. "If the transfer is delayed, we'll push the meeting. It's not complicated." He ended the call and caught sight of Linda dusting the hallway portrait, the one of his late father in a dark suit with a stoic expression. The eyes in the painting were hard to read, steady, assessing, familiar in a way that made Linda's stomach tighten. Michael didn't bother with pleasantries. "Try not to scratch that frame," he said, slipping on his watch. "It's antique." She kept her voice even. "Of course." He paused, perhaps waiting for her to bring up the salary again. When she didn't, he smiled as if victory had been confirmed. "Good," he said. "I like it when people understand their role." Linda set the duster down for a moment, her fingers tracing a tiny speck on the glass. "Roles can change," she said before she could stop herself. Michael's eyes flickered. "Not in this house." He swept past her toward the library, the room where business and ritual tangled like the leather-bound books that lined the walls. He opened the door with a practiced motion and disappeared inside, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne and a certainty that the day would obey him. Linda waited until the door clicked shut before she turned back to the portrait, and for a breath she saw the late father, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a man who might have once understood hard choices before they were drowned by easier ones. Later, while tidying the study, she noticed the small leather box again, subtle, deliberate, out of place among the clean lines of Michael's newer acquisitions. There was a key impression pressed into the velvet of its interior, a shape she recognized, though she had never seen the key used. A few weeks earlier, she had picked up a jacket from the back of a chair and felt something heavy in the pocket, a simple object cold against her hand for the second it took to return the jacket to where it had been. She had not touched it then. She had only noticed the weight and the way Michael's posture changed when he slipped the jacket on and patted the pocket, confirming the presence of something that soothed him like a mantra. "I'm not here to break anything," she told herself, aligning papers on the desk. "I'm here to keep things from breaking me." While polishing a side table by the window, she watched as a courier car rolled through the gates and stopped by the front steps. The driver carried a small envelope, the kind that doesn't look important until you see the way the receiver's face tightens upon reading it. The envelope bore a familiar letterhead, the Boston firm. The butler signed, delivered it to the library, and moments later Michael emerged with a phone clamped to his ear, irritation etched deep across his forehead. "We already settled that issue. It's done," he snapped. "I have the documentation somewhere. Don't start this now." His eyes scanned the hall as if trying to spot a misfiled memory. Linda lowered her gaze and moved past him, but inside she was sifting through her own carefully kept archive. Documentation. Somewhere. The word pricked at her. She had dusted every shelf, lifted every book to wipe beneath it, and learned the difference between objects placed as decoration and objects placed with a purpose. She knew which drawer stuck, which hinge squeaked, which picture frame had been opened and reclosed, and she knew that not everything documented lived where documentation belonged. That night, after her shift at the diner, she stood on the apartment balcony, breathing the cool air, the city lights glittering like a promise too beautiful to last. Ethan padded out in his socks, rubbing his eyes. "Mum, why are you still awake?" She wrapped an arm around him. "Thinking," she said softly, "about work, about life, about decisions, about how sometimes people don't see what's right in front of them." He leaned into her. "Like when I lost my homework and it was in my folder." She laughed quietly. "Something like that, baby." He yawned and rested his head against her shoulder. "Are we going to be okay?" he asked. That same question he asked on hard weeks, the one she answered with truth disguised as certainty. "We're going to keep moving forward," she said. "That's what we do." After he fell asleep, she returned to the table and removed the worn photograph from the folder. It was taken years earlier in a different mansion, a moment captured at a charity event where staff were allowed a brief overlap with guests. In the background stood a familiar man whose name never appeared on the guest list, and next to him, the late father with his hand on a leather box. Most people would have missed it. Linda never did. Some images survive not because they are clear, but because they carry a feeling you can't shake. She slid the photograph beneath the top page again, and closed the folder with a breath that steadied her. Morning brought Michael another series of calls and another argument with the Boston attorneys. "You will not delay the probate transfer," he said in a clipped tone. "I'm the sole beneficiary. There is no dispute." He listened, jaw tightening, then spoke through his teeth. "If a witness list is missing, find it. I'm not reorganizing my life because someone misfiled a decade-old statement." He hung up and stared at the ceiling, then at the portrait in the hall, and finally at the door to the library. For the first time, the house felt a fraction smaller, the lines of control a little less certain. Linda crossed the hallway with a laundry basket and paused. Michael looked up, irritated by his own hesitation. "What is it?" he demanded, as if she'd asked a question. She met his gaze without flinching. "Nothing, sir." He pivoted, moving toward the stairs, then stopped, as if the air itself had caught his sleeve. Did anyone put a brown envelope in my office yesterday?" he asked, the question dropping as casually as he could make it, casual in the way people try to be when the answer matters. I manage the dust, not the mail, Linda said, careful with each word. Right, he replied and forced a smile that didn't touch his eyes. Forget it. But he couldn't. He pushed open the library door and remained there longer than usual, shuffling papers, checking drawers, pacing in front of the shelf where the leather box sat, like a reminder of a father he admired for his ruthlessness and resented for the same reason. Linda finished her tasks in the hall and moved toward the kitchen, but the silence in the house had changed texture. She felt it the way a person feels the weather altering before the rain, pressure shifting, clouds gathering, and inevitability approaching. In that growing quiet, Linda recognized the invisible fulcrum beneath both their lives. She knew where certain documents had once rested and where they no longer were. She knew the name that kept appearing on envelopes and the date circled in pencil on the back page of a planner that should have been discarded but wasn't. She knew there was a key whose cold weight had comforted Michael, and a lock that did not belong to anything in the house. And she knew that the line between being invisible and being essential was thinner than most people understood. Some things only open when the right person is standing in front of them, she said under her breath, putting away the last of the glasses. The words weren't a threat, they were a truth she had come to accept. Not all keys are made of metal, and not all locks are built into doors. Sometimes access is a map of small acts remembered, a sequence of details only the attentive can follow. She had not asked to hold any of it, but life had placed it in her path, and now her journey, Ethan's future, and Michael's certainty were braided together by a thread he couldn't see. At the end of the day, as the sun slipped behind the skyline and drenched the mansion in a soft amber glow, Michael stood on the balcony with his phone silent in his pocket. For a man who thrived on momentum, the stillness was uncomfortable. He told himself it was a temporary snag, a paperwork issue, a minor inconvenience amplified by incompetent people. He set his jaw, the familiar mask of control, sliding back into place. Power, he believed, is the ability to decide what matters and what doesn't, and to enforce the difference. Inside, Linda gathered her things and headed for the service exit. She paused near the study, glancing once at the closed drawer that stuck on humid days, and the frame that had been relatched with a slightly different angle than before. Her breath steadied. This wasn't about revenge, it was about clarity, about a hidden truth that was ready to walk out of the shadows. She placed a small note, nothing revealing, only a neat reminder about a routine cleaning, on the edge of the desk, and turned off the lamp. In the faint reflection on the window, she saw the outline of the woman she had become. Tired, yes, but unafraid. Her decisions from here would not be made from fear, but from purpose. As she stepped into the night, the city breathed around her, alive with stories overlapping and diverging. Some journeys are chosen, and some choose you. Linda's had chosen her the day she first walked into that mansion and realized that the value of what she did could never be measured by the person who paid her. Now, as the air cooled and the streetlights hummed, the quiet pieces she had carried began to settle into place, aligning like constellations that only make sense when you stand back far enough to see the design. And back inside the house, Michael reached for the leather box without thinking, then stopped, his hand hovering as if the weight of the moment had finally caught up, drawing a thin line between what he thought he owned and what he would soon discover he could no longer control. The following morning carried the kind of silence that felt unnatural inside Michael's mansion. The usual rhythm of ringing phones, incoming emails, and the distant hum of staff footsteps was replaced by something heavier, something almost oppressive. Michael sat at his desk in the library, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. Lines of numbers scrolled across the monitor, each one striking him harder than the last. He rubbed his temples, muttering to himself, "This can't be right. It's just a glitch. It has to be." But the numbers did not change. His portfolio, once a fortress of growth and security, was bleeding. Investments he had been convinced were untouchable were collapsing in real time. Calls from his broker had gone from optimistic to urgent, and now they were frantic. His phone vibrated again. "Michael, listen to me," the voice on the other end pressed. "We've got a serious problem. The acquisition paperwork isn't complete. Without the supporting documents, the board won't release the funds, and if that happens, the other side will back out. Do you understand? The entire deal is at risk." Michael's jaw clenched as he gripped the phone. "Don't tell me about risk. Fix it. That's what I pay you for." "You don't get it," the broker replied sharply. "I can't fix it without those estate records. We've asked you for them 3 times. If you can't produce them, the contracts freeze. No signatures, no money, no deal." For a moment, Michael said nothing. The name of the Boston law firm flashed across his mind like an unwelcome ghost. He remembered the courier envelopes, the ones he had shoved into drawers, telling himself he would handle them later. He remembered the leather box, his father's handwriting, and the unease he always felt whenever he saw it. He told himself it was under control, but the truth was beginning to rise like water through the cracks. He ended the call abruptly and leaned back, in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His empire wasn't built on air, but right now it felt as fragile as glass. He had dismissed Linda's pleas just hours ago, had called her wages insignificant, yet now the irony twisted in his stomach. What he truly needed, what the board demanded, what the contracts required, was locked away in the very estate files that Linda had brushed against countless times while dusting his study and tidying his father's old collection. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. How did it come to this? His mind raced through options, calculating like it always did. Could he pressure the attorneys, threaten the board, buy more time? But time was already gone. He needed those documents, and he needed them now. And there was one person who knew the house, the files, the hidden places better than anyone else. Linda. The thought made his pride rise like fire in his chest. He remembered the look in her eyes when she said, "To you it's small, to me it's everything." At the time he had brushed it off as melodrama, but now, staring at numbers plummeting across his screen, he realized it was more than a plea. It was a warning he hadn't understood. Michael stood abruptly, pacing across the library. The leather box caught his eye again, sitting quietly on the shelf as if mocking him. He pulled it down, fumbling with the latch, and opened it to find only fragments. Old letters, faded receipts, and a gap where something heavier had once rested. He slammed it shut, his frustration echoing off the walls. When Linda arrived later that morning, carrying her cleaning supplies with the same steady composure as always, Michael caught her in the hallway. His voice was sharper than intended, fueled by panic he was trying to disguise. "Linda, did you move anything in my study yesterday?" She stopped, her eyes meeting his. "I cleaned, like I always do. Nothing more." He studied her face, looking for a crack in her calm expression, some hint of recognition. But Linda had learned long ago how to wear a mask of silence. "Don't play games with me," Michael pressed, lowering his voice. "There are documents, important documents that I need. They're not where they should be. Did you see them?" Her hands tightened on the cleaning rag she held, but her voice remained steady. "I don't move what doesn't belong to me." He stepped closer, lowering his tone further, his words laced with desperation he couldn't quite hide. "You don't understand. What's at stake? Without those files, I stand to lose everything. Do you hear me? Everything!" Linda tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I thought you said some things were insignificant." The words landed like a blade. Michael opened his mouth, then shut it again, realizing how hollow his previous arrogance sounded now. For the first time in years, he felt stripped of control, as though the balance of power in his own house had shifted under his feet. He wanted to demand, to command, as he always did, but he knew instinctively that authority wouldn't work here. This wasn't about issuing orders anymore. It was about something else entirely, something he wasn't used to. Asking. "Linda," he said, his voice softer now, though it tasted bitter in his mouth. If you know anything, if you've seen anything, I need your help, and I'll make it worth your while. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Worth my while? She echoed. Yes, money, benefits, whatever you want, he insisted. Quickly, just help me find what I need. She let the silence hang for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Then she said, almost in a whisper, some things can't be bought, Mr. Carter. Not with money, not with promises. Michael's chest tightened. It was not the answer he expected, and it rattled him more than the losses piling up on his computer screen. He realized then that the woman he had dismissed as invisible was no longer just his maid. She was holding a thread that could either unravel his empire or keep it together, and she knew it. As the storm outside began to gather again, thunder rolling across the sky, Michael felt a strange chill run down his spine. Pride and desperation clashed within him, each demanding control. He had built his life on the belief that he controlled outcomes, that his decisions shaped reality. But now, the hidden truth was undeniable. The future of his fortune rested not in his own hands, but in Linda's. And as he watched her walk past him, her steps, calm and deliberate, he understood that his journey had shifted into unfamiliar territory. The decisions he had once made without thought now pressed against him with unbearable weight. Every choice from this moment forward would carry consequences he could no longer escape, and the transformation that awaited him was already beginning to take shape in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Michael had spent years constructing an identity built on control. In boardrooms, his voice carried the authority to close deals and silence opposition. In his mansion, every detail reinforced the image of a man above consequence. Polished marble, towering glass windows, and art pieces that signaled not taste, but dominance. Yet in that single moment, standing in the hallway with Linda, he felt something he had not felt in decades. Small. The certainty that had defined his decisions cracked, and the fracture revealed a truth he could no longer deny. The woman he had treated as invisible was suddenly the axis on which his future turned. The realization came not with a dramatic outburst, but in the quiet that followed her words. Some things can't be bought, Mr. Carter. He had heard defiance before, had seen employees walk out, competitors challenge him, lawyers push back. But this was different. Linda wasn't fighting for herself alone. She was standing on ground he couldn't reach, holding a piece of the puzzle his empire now depended on. Michael tried to shake the thought off as he returned to the library, but the unease followed him like a shadow. He looked at the leather box again, his father's legacy staring at him from the shelf, and for the first time he saw it not as a treasure, but as a cage. His father's wealth had given him everything, yet it now demanded something he didn't possess. He had dismissed Linda for years, reducing her presence to background noise, but she had been in this house longer than many of his business partners. She knew its corners, its rhythms, its secrets, and in those unnoticed details lived the key to his survival. He poured himself a drink, the glass trembling slightly in his hand. "She's just a maid," he whispered, as if saying it aloud could restore the hierarchy he relied on. But even as the words left his lips, they rang hollow. Linda, meanwhile, moved through the house with quiet grace, her footsteps soft but steady. For years she had performed her duties unnoticed, blending into the background of Michael's opulence. Yet now, every gesture carried a weight he could feel. When she straightened a stack of papers, he wondered if she knew more than she showed. When she closed a drawer, he felt a pang of suspicion. Was something missing, or was it always like that? The balance of power had shifted so completely that he found himself watching her, the same way investors watched stock tickers when the market grew volatile. The transformation unsettled him. Michael had built his empire on the belief that people were assets to be managed or obstacles to be removed. But Linda didn't fit into either category anymore. She was neither asset nor obstacle. She was a gatekeeper, and the gate she guarded wasn't one he could break open with money or threats. He tried again, later in the afternoon, to approach her with authority. "Linda," he said, his tone sharper than he intended, "if you know anything about those estate papers, you should tell me now. It would be beneficial for you." She didn't look up from the silverware. She was polishing. "I've already told you, Mr. Carter. I don't move what isn't mine." His frustration bubbled, but beneath it was something new. Fear. He wasn't used to being refused, and certainly not by someone he considered beneath his notice. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't a game. Millions are at stake." Linda placed the last fork neatly on the table, her movements deliberate, and finally met his gaze. "And so is my son's future. You didn't think about that when you said my pay was insignificant." The words hit him harder than any market crash or failed negotiation. In her calm defiance, he saw a mirror reflecting his own arrogance back at him. He had believed his world was unshakable, but her presence proved otherwise. She was no longer just the maid in his mansion. She was the fulcrum, and without her, the weight of his empire would tip and collapse. The day stretched on, each minute amplifying the reversal of fortune. Calls from lawyers confirmed what he already knew. Without the missing documents, his contracts would be frozen indefinitely. Investors were already murmuring about pulling out, and his name, once a guarantee of stability, was now whispered with doubt. The man who prided himself on being indispensable was discovering that his fate rested in the hands of the very person he had considered disposable. Michael sat alone in his study that evening, staring at the city lights beyond the glass wall. The skyline, once a symbol of his triumph, now looked distant, untouchable. He thought of his father's voice, the lessons about power and dominance that had shaped him. Never show weakness, never depend on anyone. It had been his mantra, his mindset, his armor. But armor, he realized, can rust, and in its place, vulnerability seeps through. He closed his eyes and whispered into the silence, "How did I let it come to this?" Behind him, Linda moved quietly, gathering her things before leaving for the night. He almost called out to her, almost asked her directly for help, but pride still chained his tongue. He watched her instead, the way she carried herself, not with arrogance, but with the dignity of someone who knew the value of her work, even if he had failed to see it. And for the first time, Michael wondered what she truly thought of him, not as her employer, but as a man stripped of his illusions. The reversal was undeniable. In a single day, the lines between servant and master had blurred, and Michael was left standing, on the weaker side. Linda, without raising her voice or demanding attention, had become the most powerful figure in his life. He needed her more than she needed him, and that truth was a weight he couldn't escape. As the night deepened, Michael realized that his journey was no longer about wealth or reputation. It was about confronting the hidden truths he had buried beneath arrogance. It was about the impact of decisions made carelessly, the behind-the-scenes consequences of words spoken without thought. And though he didn't yet know how, he sensed that Linda held not just the key to his fortune, but the key to a transformation he had never imagined possible. When the front door finally closed behind her, the silence that followed was deafening. Michael sat in the darkened study, the leather box still on his desk, and understood that the power he once believed eternal had shifted hands. And as the storm clouds gathered again over the city, the fragile empire he had built stood on the edge of collapse, waiting for the choice that would determine whether it endured or crumbled. Morning bled into afternoon with the kind of weight that makes a house feel smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. Michael's study had become a battlefield of unanswered emails, blinking notifications, and contracts that were suddenly worth nothing without the missing estate documents. The Boston attorneys had moved from polite reminders to written warnings, and the board's patience was thinning like ice in late spring. He tried to bury the rising panic under familiar armor, decisive posture, clipped words, a show of certainty, but the performance no longer convinced even himself. He needed Linda. The admission sat in his throat like a stone he couldn't swallow. He found her in the kitchen, the quiet center of a mansion built for noise. She stood by the sink, rinsing a set of crystal glasses with the same care she used for everything, as if attention itself were a kind of prayer. "Linda," he started, voice taut, "we need to have a real conversation." She didn't look over. "We already did. This isn't about yesterday." He swallowed. "It's about the estate files, my father's records. There's a gap I can't account for, a witness list, a codicil reference, something the attorneys say exists but can't locate. You've worked here longer than most of my assistants. You've seen things others haven't." She set a glass upside down on the towel, turned, and met his gaze. Without flinching, "I've seen a lot. Most of it I was paid to clean, not to keep." He felt the rebuke and pushed past it. Authority had always been his lever. Now it wobbled in his hand. "I'm asking you directly. Did you see a brown envelope? A dated letter from my father's attorney? Anything that looked like a witness affidavit?" Her eyes softened for the briefest moment, then steadied. "I'm not your memory." The answer was simple, but it moved through him like cold air. The old reflex surged. He could demand, he could threaten termination, he could remind her of the hierarchy. But even as the impulse rose, he recognized its uselessness. The balance had shifted. His decisions had brought him here, not hers, and if there was a way forward, it wouldn't be carved by force. He tried persuasion next, the voice he used in investor calls, warmer, practiced, almost human. "Linda, listen, if you help me secure those files, I can do a great deal for you. I can increase your salary substantially. I can cover medical expenses, arrange a better apartment. I can—" She shook her head. "You think this is about what you can buy. It's about solutions," he corrected too quickly. "I'm offering a way to make both our problems disappear." "My problem is not an opportunity for your convenience," she said. "My problem exists because you decided I didn't matter." The words landed with precise impact. He exhaled through his nose, pacing once around the island. A different tactic. Bribery, dressed as generosity. "All right," he said carefully. "Name it. Whatever number you think is fair. I'll match it. Double it." "For what?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "For pretending you didn't say my wages were insignificant. For helping you patch a hole you drilled yourself. Money won't fix what you keep breaking." He bristled. "This is not about morality. It's about documentation." "It's always been about morality," she replied, and for the first time her tone carried a weight that made him feel the floor. "You just couldn't see it from where you were standing." The kitchen grew quiet enough that the hum of the refrigerator sounded like a clock ticking down. Pride pressed against desperation inside him, two forces that had always been separated by distance and now occupied the same small room. Somewhere down the hall, his phone vibrated again. Attorneys, investors, consequences. He didn't move. He looked at Linda as if trying to learn a language he had never bothered to speak. "I need your help," he said, and this time the words were unvarnished. "If the records aren't produced by tomorrow, the release is frozen. The acquisition fails. I lose more than money." He caught himself, and the old habit fell away. "I lose the company my father built." She studied him, searching for what was different and what hadn't changed at all. "You want me to care about your legacy. I'm asking you to help me find what I can't find alone." Silence again. In it, Linda heard the behind-the-scenes rhythm of his life. Men calling favors, deals routed around compassion, respect measured by returns. She had cleaned the edges of that rhythm for years. She had lived in its shadow. And she was tired of explaining the value of dignity to someone who treated it like a line item. She turned to the window, watching sunlight break through a thin stretch of cloud, the lawn gleaming like a promise the house never kept. "Do you know what you told me yesterday?" She asked. "You told me the money I earned was insignificant. You told me I was replaceable, that my work had no impact. You wanted me to feel small enough to disappear." His jaw tightened. "I was wrong. You weren't careless," she said. "You were clear." "Then let me be clear now," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice because this wasn't a negotiation and also because it was. "Help me, please." The word surprised them both. Please. It didn't sound oily or strategic. It sounded human, scraped raw by a day that had stripped away his armor. Linda didn't move, didn't soften, but something in the air shifted, the space that opens when two truths finally face each other without shouting. I don't trade in apologies I can't use, she said. I trade in actions, in decisions you stand behind when the cameras are off and the contracts are signed. If I help you, it won't be because you promise me something you can forget next week. What do you want? He hated how eager it sounded and let it stand anyway. I want you to understand, she replied, not pretend. Understand that the people who make your life possible are not props. Understand that later is how you bury responsibility. Understand that respect is not a decorative word you take out at charity dinners. If you understand that, the rest follows. I can show you, he said. I can prove it. You can start, she corrected. They held each other's gaze long enough for the old hierarchy to look like a costume both had outgrown. Then footsteps broke the moment. The butler with a message, the board chair on line 2, urgency layered on urgency. Michael didn't answer. He nodded the butler away and spoke again, quieter. If I asked where to begin, would you tell me? Her eyes narrowed slightly, reading the question beneath the question. I'd tell you to begin with what you've been avoiding. He knew what that meant. The leather box, the portrait, the dates and names the attorneys needed, and the witness list that proved his father had amended more than anyone wanted to admit. The hidden truth wasn't that the fortune was missing. It was that the fortune had strings tied to promises, and promises required people, not just signatures. He had spent years collecting keys. He had never learned how to knock. He tried one last angle, a remnant of the man he had been 12 hours earlier. If you lead me to what I need, I'll fix the rest. And if I don't? She asked. He looked at the floor, then back at her. Then I learn what losing feels like. That's not the lesson you're afraid of, she said softly. You're afraid of learning that people you called insignificant were carrying you the whole time. The truth in that sentence cut cleanly, and he didn't deflect it. The shift inside him was not dramatic. It was the slow, undeniable tilt of a room you thought was level. He nodded once, a small surrender to gravity. All right. It didn't mean trust had formed. It meant a door had cracked open, and the light from the other side was unfamiliar enough to make him squint. He took a breath and stepped through as far as pride would allow. I'm going to call the attorneys and stall them for a few hours, he said. I can buy time, not much. If there is anything, any path you think I should take, tell me how to prepare. She considered him, weighed the tone, listened for the old superiority wrapped in new words. Prepare to listen, she said. Prepare to sign what you said you'd sign and pay what you said you'd pay. Prepare to respect the people whose names you don't know yet. If you can't do that, nothing you recover will matter. His phone buzzed again. The board chair this time, followed by a text from his broker. Frozen until probate clarified. Clock is running. He silenced both and looked at Linda, the woman he had once trained himself not to see. Show me what listening looks like, he said, and it wasn't rhetoric. She nodded once, neither forgiving nor condemning, simply acknowledging a choice. Then we start in the library, she said, where your father left things he didn't have time to explain. He led the way, but not in the old sense. He opened the door and stood aside. She entered first and moved with the assurance of someone who had learned the room's map by heart. He noticed for the first time the quiet competence he had spent years ignoring, the way her hands didn't hesitate, the way her eyes found the details that vanished for everyone else. She crossed to a lower shelf, hesitated at a gap between ledgers, and then traced the edge of the wood with her fingertips. This sticks, she said, on humid days. He blinked. I never noticed. You weren't looking, she said. She slid out a thin binder that had been tucked behind the ledgers and laid it on the desk. Inside, plastic sleeves held scans of documents, a partial chain, notarized letters, a draft codicil reference, a witness name that matched the Boston letterhead. I didn't hide this, she added, anticipating the thought. I protected it from the cleaning crew you rotate every 3 months. Important things get thrown out by people who don't know what they're touching. He ran his finger along the top sheet, then stopped. This might be enough to get them to release the hold. It might get them to listen, she said. But you'll still have to answer for what's missing. He nodded, the old impulse to argue falling away. I can contact the witness. I can fix what I let sit. She closed the binder and placed it back in his hands, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. You can begin to fix it, she said. The rest will be decided by how you act when no one is forcing you. The air in the library shifted again, not a truce, but a recalibration. He felt the strange relief of choosing the harder thing and the unfamiliar strength of not being the strongest person in the room. Pride had not left him. It had been given a new job, to hold the door open rather than slam it shut. He looked at Linda and found himself asking something he never would have asked yesterday. What would you do if you were me? I'd stop proving I'm right, she said, and start proving I can change. He let the words settle. The journey he had always imagined as a climb looked different from here. It looked like a descent into rooms he had avoided, a series of decisions that built a foundation rather than a facade. Somewhere in the mansion, a grandfather clock chimed, each note sounding like a deadline and an opening at once. He called the attorneys and spoke in a voice they had never heard from him, measured, accountable, present. He sent the scans and agreed to the uncomfortable steps. He messaged the board chair and didn't bluff. When he hung up, the room remained the same. Portrait, shelves, glass, but everything inside it had moved an inch toward honesty. Thank you, he said. And for once the phrase wasn't transactional. I didn't do this for you, Linda replied. I did it, so the truth wouldn't get buried. He accepted that, understanding that the help he'd received was principled, not purchased. He felt the first flicker of something like humility, unsteady, awkward, but real enough to change his posture. Money had built the mansion. It could not carry this moment. Only character could, and his was under renovation. From the doorway, sounds of the staff filtered in. A cart rolling, a distant laugh, the house breathing again. The empire hadn't been saved. The contracts weren't signed. The witness hadn't been reached. But the axis of power had turned and settled in a new place, one that demanded a different kind of strength. He looked at Linda and recognized the lesson forming, the one he'd resisted. Money without humanity is a room full of locked doors. He opened his mouth to speak and stopped as a new message lit his phone. Witness location identified, need confirmation to proceed. The timing felt like a test and an invitation. He glanced at the leather box, at the binder in his hands, then back to Linda, the person who had changed the angle of his world without raising her voice. And he understood that the next words out of his mouth would decide not only the deal, but the kind of man who walked out of this room. Michael stared at the glowing message on his phone. Witness location identified, need confirmation to proceed, and felt the weight of a crossroads settle on his chest. In the old version of himself, the next move would have been automatic, confirm, command, keep people in line with deadlines and signatures. But standing in the library with the binder Linda had placed in his hands and the leather box that had suddenly become less talisman and more relic, he understood that this moment wasn't about speed. It was about direction. A change of strategy without a change of heart would be just another performance, another behind-the-scenes calculation that did nothing to repair the hidden truth she'd laid bare. Pride pressed its case on one shoulder. Something quieter, something like conscience, took the other. And in that fragile pause, a different mindset began to take shape. He looked up and found Linda still in the doorway, neither waiting for him nor walking away. She was simply present, steady in a house that had never made space for her to be anything but invisible. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice didn't carry authority so much as intent. I owe you your salary, he said. Today. Not a promise, a payment. He swallowed. I was wrong. She didn't move, didn't soften at the sound of the words as if she'd been waiting for them her entire life. She had not. She'd been waiting for something else. Proof that words could become decisions. "Wrong is a beginning," she said, and the gentleness in her tone didn't blunt the edge. "What you build after that is what counts." He nodded, as if taking instructions in a language he was only just learning. He texted his accountant, then the property manager, then the payroll service. No theatrics, no deferments. He authorized an immediate transfer to Linda for the missed wages with interest, and he sent a directive that codified overtime procedures and back pay for every person in his household staff who had been undercredited. His thumb hovered before the final message to the board chair. He edited the opening twice, deleting the phrases that protected ego, and settled on the truth. "Confirm witness contact. Documentation incoming. Delays are my responsibility. I'll brief you at 4. He pressed send and felt a strange relief, the way a storm feels cleaner after the first hard rain. "Come with me," he said, as if the sentence might snap and fall apart if he over-explained it. He led Linda down the hall, not like a CEO marching through his domain, but like someone inviting a person into a room they had always kept closed. In the kitchen, the head housekeeper and 2 junior staffers paused when they saw him. They were used to his voice as a ripple of pressure, not as a tide-shifting course. "I owe you all acknowledgement and correction," he said. The words were unpolished and unadorned, but they sounded truer for it. "Back pay is being processed today. Overtime will be tracked differently from now on. Job security will not depend on silence." He hesitated and let the next sentence come without armor. "And if I have treated you as if your work were invisible, I apologize. That changes now." A glass clinked softly on stainless steel, the small sound of shock breaking into the room's hush. The head housekeeper, the woman who had once warned Linda that people like Michael noticed everything except the people, tilted her head and said, cautious and flat, "We've heard promises before. You'll see transfers before the hour is out," he replied. "If you don't, you'll see me explaining why to each of you. Not to a manager, to you." He meant it. They believed him only enough to look at Linda, a quiet question asking whether any of this had weight. She didn't nod, she didn't vouch. She stood there with dignity that asked nothing for itself and demanded everything of the moment, and in that space, Michael realized that the endorsement he wanted wasn't hers to give. He would have to earn something different and harder: continuity, consistency, the patient, repetitive proof that transformation was not a one-day spectacle. Back in the library, he called the attorneys and confirmed the witness outreach. He sent the scans Linda had protected, then listened, really listened, as the senior partner laid out the gaps. "There's a supplemental letter we're still missing," the attorney said. "Your father referenced it in dictation, but we never received a copy. If it can't be produced, the probate court will delay approval." Michael's instinct was to argue. Instead, he said, "Understood. I'll own the delay if it happens." When the call ended, he stood without moving, the quiet returning like a test of whether his earlier impulses would rush back and fill the room. They didn't. He turned to Linda. "There's something I never asked," he said. "Did my father ever speak to you? Not at events." "Here," she considered. "Not often. Once he asked me if I liked the old records in the music room. I told him they reminded me of my mother's kitchen. He smiled at the floor, not at me. What did that smile mean?" he asked. And the question carried none of its old condescension, no assumption that he already knew the answer. "That the past was a place he visited when he ran out of present tense," she said. "People do that when they have unfinished business." He felt the sentence click into a larger shape. Unfinished business. Behind the portrait, a small draft made the frame quiver ever so slightly. He had never noticed it before. He looked at Linda, and she nodded once, not as permission, but as confirmation that he was at last learning how to see. He lifted the frame gently and found a shallow cavity, a few slips of paper. None of the rotating cleaning crews had a reason to search. A receipt, a dog-eared card with a number, and a folded letter whose edges had softened with time. He opened it and read his father's tight handwriting. A reference to the supplemental witness statement, a line about amending a charitable trust, and, in words that startled him more than any figure on a spreadsheet, a note asking whoever found this to make things right where I left them wrong. Michael's throat tightened. He knew, he said quietly. He knew he hadn't finished. Linda's expression didn't change. Knowing is the easy part. He scanned the letter to the attorneys and stared down the old impulse to choreograph this discovery into a triumph. It wasn't. It was a correction, a necessary one. He put the paper back in the cavity for a moment, not to hide it, but to acknowledge the place where it had waited for him to become a different kind of man. Linda, he said, and this time the sound of her name carried respect, not request. I'm sorry I reduced your life to what you could do for me. I'm sorry I used the word insignificant. There isn't a number I can attach to what that did, but I can change what I do next. She listened without rescuing him from the discomfort of his own words. People say sorry when they want to keep the world the same, she said. Change is when they make different decisions after they stop saying it. I intend to, he said, and caught himself. No, scratch. That, I will. She looked at him then with a kind of measured curiosity, the way you look at a bridge you've crossed 1,000 times that suddenly has a new plank. Then start by making right what you can touch, your staff, your contracts, your son, if you ever have one, so he doesn't learn this version of power. Start where you live. I can do that, he said, and the words weren't inflated with bravado. They were anchored. He walked with her to the front hall. Not because their conversation was over, but because an honest day has many rooms, and each requires the same posture. The butler met them with a tablet. Transfers are in, he said, surprised and struggling not to show it. Payroll confirms receipt. Michael nodded and stepped aside so the news reached who it needed to reach before it settled into his own chest. In the corner, the head housekeeper glanced at the screen, blinked, and allowed the smallest fraction of skepticism to ease. There was no applause, no sudden warmth, just the beginning of something that might hold if it didn't try to rush past the slow work of repair. By late afternoon, the attorneys had scheduled a call with the witness, and the board chair, stiff but receptive, had accepted Michael's accountability in writing. The market didn't cheer, the screens didn't pop back into green like a miracle healing, but the free fall slowed, and in its place came a controllable descent. He sent a message to the operations team spotlighting 2 managers whose practices mirrored his worst habits and set a review, not as punishment, but as culture surgery. He wrote a note to the head housekeeper asking for a meeting about staffing ratios and expected to be told things he hadn't wanted to hear. He opened his father's letter again and read the final line twice, then folded it as carefully as if the paper could bruise. In the evening, when the mansion's gold light spilled across the lawn and the city began its soft shift into night, he walked out back and found Linda near the service entrance, tying the strap of her tote. He didn't block her path or force a speech into a space where a day's work had already used up its words. He simply stood there, the way you stand beside a person who has taught you something you should have known without needing to be taught. Thank you, he said, voice low. Not for the papers, for the mirror. She put a hand on the strap and met him with the same steadiness that had unsettled him that morning and guided him that afternoon. Mirrors don't change anyone, she said. They show you where to start. He nodded. Then I'll keep starting. Good, she said, because there's more to fix than you can see from here. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a checklist to convert into a victory lap. He let the sentence hang as an instruction that would take a season, not a news cycle. He stepped back so she could pass. She walked into the cooling air of evening with the same quiet composure she always carried, the dignity that had turned a house of locked doors into a map only the attentive could follow. She wasn't a symbol to him anymore. She wasn't leverage. She was a person whose life had an impact beyond the edges of his story, and that revelation reshaped the outline of his own. Inside, his phone buzzed again. The witness was ready to talk at 9 the next morning. The attorneys recommended a careful approach, a tone that acknowledged the history rather than contesting it. He typed back, "Understood. I'll be there." Before he set the phone down, he drafted one more message to himself, a note that would pop up at 7. Meet with staff, listen first, confirm payroll changes, apologize with actions. It wasn't profound, but the small, repeatable decisions were the scaffolding of a different man. He returned to the library and looked once more at the space behind the portrait, the cavity that had held a letter and a confession. He didn't close it too quickly. Some openings should remain visible. Until the lesson settles, the house was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that pretends nothing has happened. It was the quiet that follows a day of revelations and prepares a room for what must come when the sun rises. A conversation with a witness, an argument with a board chair that doesn't turn into a war, a payroll system that doesn't ask people to wait for their dignity. He switched off the lamp, let the city's glow take over, and felt the simple weight of choice press again, not as punishment, but as invitation. Redemption or regret isn't a headline, it's a series of steps taken when no one is keeping score. He took one more, then another, and as the mansion settled into night, the outline of tomorrow took shape, not as a rescue, but as a path he could walk without the old costume. Linda's footsteps faded at the end of the drive, steady as a metronome. He listened to the rhythm and found the courage to match it, knowing the next door would open not with a key he owned, but with the person he was willing to become. The following morning broke with a thin grey light, stretching across the mansion's polished windows as if reluctant to wake the house inside. Michael rose earlier than usual, his sleep shallow and fractured by thoughts that pressed like unanswered questions. He moved through his morning routine mechanically, shower, suit, coffee poured into a crystal cup, but each familiar detail felt altered, stripped of the authority it once carried. The reflection in the mirror was the same tailored man, yet there was something different behind his eyes, the faint recognition that wealth had armored him against the wrong battles and left him unprepared for the ones that mattered most. He sat at the library desk, the witness's number glowing on his phone, his father's letter unfolded before him. He could feel the weight of both pressing on his chest, legacy and choice, past and present. And in that liminal space between hesitation and action, he heard a sound that startled him. Not the ring of the phone or the creak of the mansion floorboards, but laughter, light and unrestrained, echoing faintly from the garden. He stood and followed it. Outside, Linda was speaking softly to her son Ethan, who had accompanied her for the morning. The boy, no more than 9, held a small toy car that he raced along the stone edge of the fountain. His laughter rose with every slip of the wheels, a sound so pure it cut through the mansion's heavy silence. Michael froze, at the edge of the patio, watching a scene that felt at once ordinary and revelatory. A mother with her child, sharing joy without wealth, without marble floors, without contracts or inheritance. Ethan looked up and saw him. "Hi," the boy said simply, as if greeting a neighbor instead of the man who had once dismissed his mother's worth. Michael cleared his throat, unprepared for the innocence in the child's voice. "Hello," he replied, softer than intended. Ethan held up the toy car proudly. "Mum says, if I take care of things, even the small ones, they last longer. I've had this since I was little." He smiled, running it along the fountain's curve again. "She says, respect keeps things alive." Michael felt the words strike with quiet precision, more cutting than any boardroom argument. Respect keeps things alive. He thought of his father's letter, of Linda's dignity, of the wages he had once called insignificant. The boy was not teaching him finance or law, yet in that moment, Ethan revealed a truth Michael had buried under decades of ambition. Fortune without respect is a hollow inheritance, a vault filled with emptiness. He sat on the stone edge near them, his tailored suit out of place against the damp morning air. "That's wise advice," he said, his voice unsteady. He turned to Linda. "He's lucky to have you." Linda met his eyes, not with triumph, but with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. "He doesn't need luck," she answered. "He needs examples." The sentence lingered like a mirror held too close. Michael thought of the example he had been living, of the mindset he had passed on to employees, partners, anyone watching his rise. Arrogance disguised as leadership, control mistaken for strength. He realized, with a clarity that stung, that he had been building monuments to himself while neglecting the foundations that truly mattered: kindness, gratitude, humanity. The attorneys would call again soon. The witness would need his attention. But at that moment, the urgency of contracts felt secondary to the quiet lesson standing in front of him. He turned back to Ethan, who was still laughing at his toy car's unsteady race. "Your mum's right," he said. "Respect does keep things alive. I lost sight of that." Ethan tilted his head, studying him with the blunt honesty only a child can hold. "Then maybe you should take better care of your things and your people." Michael's chest tightened. Out of the mouths of children come truths too pure to ignore. He nodded slowly. "You're right." He didn't disguise it as wisdom reclaimed or experience earned. It was a simple admission, one he knew he needed to practice in action, not just say aloud. The boy grinned and went back to his game, unconcerned with the weight of his own words. But Michael carried them like a brand new compass. He looked again at Linda, and for the first time in years, he didn't see someone in his employment. He saw someone who had stood her ground when the imbalance of power should have broken her, someone who had reminded him, without anger, without bargaining, that humanity is not negotiable. The shift inside him wasn't complete, but it was undeniable. For the first time, he felt the possibility of transformation, of a journey guided not by accumulation, but by correction. The revelation was as simple as the laughter of a child, and as profound as the regrets of a father written in faded ink. Back inside the mansion, the phone began to ring again. The witness, the board, the contracts. They waited like vultures, impatient and demanding. Michael rose from the fountain's edge, the sound of Ethan's car still circling stone etched in his ears, and walked toward the library with a new rhythm in his step. He didn't yet know if the empire would survive, but he finally understood what it would mean if it didn't. Wealth could be rebuilt. Respect had to be earned, one decision at a time. He reached the library door, paused, and touched the frame as if anchoring himself to a new beginning. Behind him, Linda guided Ethan toward the gate, her voice calm, her posture unshaken, the quiet strength of someone who had carried truth all along. Michael took a breath, let the lesson settle, and prepared to face the witness call, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was slowly, painfully learning how to become. And that's where the story leaves us, with a reminder that true wealth isn't counted in bank accounts or contracts, but in the way we treat the people who walk beside us, often quietly, often unseen. If you made it this far, I'd love to know. Leave a comment with the words, "I'm with you until the end," so I know you carried this message with me all the way through. Your thoughts always add depth to these stories, and I read every single one. If the lesson touched something in you, give this video a like. It helps me bring more reflections like this to life. And if you want to keep walking through stories that speak about dignity, transformation and hidden truths that change everything, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. There's another video right here that continues along this journey. Click and come with me, because it weaves perfectly into the thread we've just unraveled together. Let's keep going.